This is the Stages of the Soul podcast, a production of the Caritas Center. I am Brian Dolan, and you know who's with me. She's legendary, Nancy Kane.
A legend without a cause is probably what it was.
And now, as you are aware, we are also posting our episodes on YouTube. So if you want to find us, we're Stages of the Soul podcast on YouTube. And also, we've got links in our show notes now, if you're listening at the audio version of this, to get you to the Caritas Center website and this episode, as well as our YouTube channel. All the things. You are so hip and happening, Nancy, on YouTube.
Staying with the times. And you're my guide. You're my guide and my journeyer along the way.
Making it up as I go, Nancy Kane. That's just what we do here. So today we're going to sound very fancy pants because we're talking about a term called acedia.
Right.
Now, I had never heard this until you said it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Greek, as I recall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It sounds fancy. The first time, like when I'm thinking about acedia, I don't know why, but I thought of Activia, that yogurt that Jamie Lee Curtis advertised. Activia, like we should be doing acedia. But it has nothing to do with regularity of any sort.
Right.
It's one of the 7 deadly sins. And if those listening are evangelical or Protestant, that's not talked about much.
No.
What are they again? Can you do all 7? It's a pop quiz.
Oh my goodness. Can I? Pride.
Pride.
Sloth, gluttony, lust, envy, acedia. I said sloth. Oh gosh, I'm missing 2.
It doesn't matter because people can look it up, A and B. You already got to the one we need.
Yeah.
Acedia is a Greek word that our translation of these days and throughout much of history for the English language would be sloth.
Right.
Now, most people, when they think sloth, think those creatures that are so cute that move so slow. Funny looking furry creatures, sloths. You like those?
Yeah, well, when I think of sloth, I think of the Zootopia, that cartoon, the hotel,
the License Bureau,
right, the License Bureau, and they're talking really slow. But that's not really what we're talking about with sloth. I think that's what we think of, but it's actually a spiritual laziness.
Yeah, and I think this is a harder one to grasp. Some of the other ones I think are quite easy. And as I was looking through some material you sent over to me, there was a couple of things that said it's not, which is sometimes helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It's not laziness, like casual laziness, as in I sometimes succumb to casual laziness. Like if I had a choice, I'd take a nap rather than get some work done. But that's not spiritual sloth. Being lazy is not spiritual sloth, right?
Right. And nor is it, right. It's not. And what it is more inclined to is where we are not doing the heavy lifting and the hard pursuit of becoming like Christ, really pressing into prayer, really desiring to be formed in Him, desiring to be obedient to Him. But here's where the catch is that some people might be listening to this and saying, oh yeah, I pray every day. I read my Bible every day. I go to the Bible study on Wednesday nights. I start rattling off all the things they're doing. And I've known people that are very busy spiritually, but they're not engaged in the hard work of self-reflection and growth.
Yeah, this is where it can get so confusing for people, I think, is that you could be busy and be slothful. You could be busy at church and be slothful. And before we dig in more to that, the other one that caught my eye, since you're a psychologist, is sloth is not depression.
Right. That's a whole other category.
It can look like depression, but it's not depression, right? In any sense.
No, and depression it has a very physical component to it. It's many times related to a circumstance. But depression it's a category in and of its own. Sloth is really related to the spiritual life, the soul life, and where you see God or how you're pursuing God or how you're engaging with Him. And it always one of the definitions you saw in some of that those documents I sent you, is it's a failure to love. It's a failure of love. So, say I have an opportunity to, I have a neighbor who's has poor health, and I think, I probably should go over there and say something to her, or bring her some flowers or whatever. And then I think, you know what, I can do that tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes, and I think, she'll never know that I wasn't really thinking of her. And, you know, in the sum of things, it really won't make that much difference. And in the meantime, then I put in place things that I find distracting and comfort producing for me. So I might go through Instagram, or I'm running through my emails, or in place of doing the harder work of saying, I'm going to take time, I'm going to go get flowers, I'm going to go over to her house, I'm going to see if she's home, I'm going to visit with her. That's all hard work. That's hard work of love. That in sloth, I just say, it really doesn't matter. Tomorrow's a better day.
And see, here's where it even gets like someone could be listening to this and go, oh, good, I'm not slothful. And actually they are. And I'm not trying to be accusatory, but
Mm-hmm.
somebody could go, listen, no, Nancy, here's good news. I volunteer at church 3 days a week. I do the food bank. I'm in the nursery. I'm teaching a Sunday school class. See, not slothful. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, you could be slothful in a spiritual sense, even if you're doing all the Christian things. Am I understanding this correctly?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So how could that be? Because this is where the tension is. You could be stressed out from church life and be slothful.
There's a gal that I work with in spiritual direction who would spend 2, sometimes 4 hours in reading the Bible and prayer. But when I asked her how much she's changed and all that, she couldn't. She looked at me like I had 4 heads, and she really didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, if you're really encountering God, then there's going to be a conviction of your soul. There's going to be a conviction in terms of your own sin. There's a conviction of your own pride. He's going to bring forward where you haven't loved well. And so what she was actually doing in all that spiritual activity was numbing herself. And I think C.S. Lewis says it well, may it be the real I that prays to the real you. And I think sometimes in prayer we can end up praying to the God that we want versus the God who is, as well as showing up as who I think I should be versus really coming to where I really am in my
Hmm.
honesty before God. But always, always when we encounter him, there'll be a transformation. There'll be a change of some sort. It might be new information about him on some days, and other days it might be deep conviction of pride that we hadn't seen in any other way. It could be a conviction of our own laziness and our refusal to really engage with him in this deeper interior work of prayer, where he's shining the light, he's showing a mirror of our soul. um, that's where the sin of sloth really comes in.
Yeah, and that's where people look at me sideways for it, but I have an aversion to the person that does the read through the Bible in a year plan every year,
Mm-hmm.
because that's not a transformative exercise. I think it's important to read through the entire scriptures at some point in your life, but
Mm-hmm.
that's an exercise of either intellectual pursuit or goal reaching, which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't often produce intimacy. You're
Right.
doing this task, and it's that Protestant work ethic, right? That is such a part of American Christian culture, which is I got to work hard for Jesus, and
Mm-hmm.
that means I'm doing the right things.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, spending 4 hours a day reading the scripture and prayer sounds pretty Christiany, uh,
Right.
but it may not produce change, and someone's still not connecting the dots. Nancy, how could you say that someone could read the Bible for 4 hours a day and not experience change that's required to not be slothful?
I'm keenly aware, and I can speak for my own life, but I'm keenly aware of how we want to numb out. So scripture can be a numbing out. It can be, like you said, an intellectual exercise. It could be. Um, there's another woman that I work with that had that same pattern of she would read quite a bit. She'd read a lot of theological articles and scripture and listening to sermons online. And um, but when I moved it towards, so who do you see Jesus to be, and what is he inviting you to? She drew a blank, because all of that wasn't really encountering him personally. It was like seeing him from a distance or observing him, or an exercise in something that was um, uh, pleasurable on some level. And I remember a spiritual director, Albert Haas, saying to me years ago, he said, people sometimes get bit by the spiritual formation bug. And what he meant by that is that we can do these things that are quote unquote spiritual formation, but it's just really it becomes an addiction. It becomes a way to numb ourselves and have good feelings, because it produces good feelings, thinking about that which is good and true and beautiful, thinking about a verse of scripture, listening to a nice sermon, um, taking time in solitude and looking at the trees and the birds and all that. That's all can produce good feelings. But to encounter God is to find our response being taking off our shoes and knowing that we're on holy ground. Hence, with Moses, when he encountered God, it was the burning bush, and God said, "Take off your shoes now. You're standing in on holy ground." And I think that this is really what we're talking about. Is I would go venture to say that sloth is on the level of epidemic proportions in the church, because I think a lot of people do exactly what you're talking about. They're super busy. They're engaged in all kinds of activities. But the litmus test will always be in our closest relationships. Do those people feel that there's radical love coming forward from us? And if they
Yeah,
don't feel that, then there's no real growth, really.
I encounter a lot of pro-Jesus people in my
Hmm.
ministry work. They like him. They're in favor of him. They know a lot about him. But they will say things or do things that are, and we all do this, but there's a measure at which is shocking to the extent the person is unaware of their lack of transformation to look like him.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, it's not just being adjacent to him and being aware of him, it's truly transformation. But there has to be a place in our spiritual life for some of the activity, right? You're not saying what the
Right.
Christian does is just seclude themselves all day and self-reflect. I mean, there's a place to volunteer, right? And to enjoy a sermon.
Yes, but it's a matter of where the center point is. If I'm the center point of my life, then I pick and choose as to what I like, what I don't like. Do I want to listen to the sermon? No, I didn't like that speaker. Oh, I'm going to go read this book. I'll go to Instagram, see what's posting. You see, in all of that, I'm deciding, um, versus starting my day and ending my day with, "You are Lord, and I submit to your leadership. Now gaze upon me as I gaze upon you, and show me who I am. Remind me again who I am. And now may my day be pleasing to you. And now what would you have me to do?" Do you see the difference? Is one is an attitude of submission and surrender and acceptance. The other is I wake up and I decide what I'm going to do. And then if I think, oh, I should be praying, then it's just a matter of like, oh, now I'm going to bring Jesus in, because he's always helpful, to my day. And I think a lot of people approach the spiritual life as Jesus is a coach. It's like he's good for a few, advice along the way, and he's always available. But that's not what when I look at the cross, that's not what the cross was about at all. It was um, it was a moment in history where everything completely changed. So if I really embrace that, that means there's a death and resurrection going on for me constantly, where everything completely changes.
So it's a disposition of and a way of living, not
Hmm.
a task. Because I could see someone even turning what you're saying into a task. Because I have this tendency. It'd be, oh, good. Okay, so now I'm going to get out of bed right away, get on my knees, and I'm going to say, Lord, show me, transform me today. Now, see, I did it.
Right. And the difference is, and I've done the same thing. The difference is who you're praying to. So if you get off on your knees and you're praying, Lord, help me to do what you want me to do today. Are you really focusing on him, or are you focusing on, whew, that felt really good. Okay, done. Got that done. Checked it off. Now I'm on to whatever I'm supposed to do next. Okay, I'm going to pray. Okay, whatever. But are you really praying? Because I think that the beginning of prayer needs to be seeing God's gaze of love on us as we gaze back at him. And in that gaze, then, like two people that really love each other, when they really love each other, there's times where they just gaze at each other and just know that they don't need to fill it with words, that there's a
Mhm.
profound connection there. And that's what Jesus is inviting us into is, will we gaze longer, and will we stay there longer and enjoy his presence and really get to know him as a person? And Acedia is the clever work of the evil one to say, no, God's okay with you spending Instagram for a few hours. It's okay that you don't pray. It's okay. It's okay. He loves you nonetheless. Well, yes and no. Um, yes, he always loves me. And no, that's not the core of the gospel. The core of the gospel, as Bonhoeffer said, is the bid to come die always. So how am I dying? To my flesh, to my inclinations, so that God can do a resurrection in me.
Sounds exhausting. Right? I mean, someone's going, "Oh gosh, I can't like laugh at a funny video of someone falling down on TikTok now, Nancy. Come on,
Yeah,
fuddy duddy."
and see, that's the misnomer is I think that actually the more I die, the more freedom I have.
Yeah.
The more I let go, the more I surrender, the more I accept my life as God has ordained it, the more there's joy there. Because I don't have to work so hard. He's not asking me to work so hard. But he is asking me, and this is a paradox, he is asking me to show up in a way that I'm really showing up. I'm not trying to fool him and myself with, yeah, I did the Bible in the year. That's good. I'm done.
In fact, I'm doing a great job because I did my quiet time today. Yeah. Well, and where it began to really click for me is in some of the articles you sent. And I'm anxious for your insights on this because you and Ray have done so much work with marriage counseling.
Hmm.
Uh, it seems like the perfect picture of acedia can be seen in many marriages,
Hmm.
where some of the writers were talking about how it manifests itself in people not putting the effort in for a healthy relationship. So, what does sloth look like in a marriage?
Getting along to get along. If I put in a soundbite, that I think that, yeah, Ray and I've worked with a lot of marriages. God has, in his great mercy towards us, taken us to deep places and continues to in our own marriage. And it is the place I think that God profoundly platforms what sanctification can look like. And so when I say that, two things. One, the divorce rate among Christians tends to be as high as the culture still. Um, and then secondly, I don't think that people are looking at most Christian marriages and saying, wow, you guys are really exemplary. Like, what's going on with your life that you guys love each other so well? Um, so I think we're failing in a very significant way. I remember years ago with mentioning Albert Haas again. I went to see him, and Ray and I were in a very difficult time in our marriage, and I'm sure I was complaining about something with Ray and expecting that Father Haas would be like, "Oh, that's oh, poor you, like really."
Boy,
I'm
he
sure,
sounds terrible.
yeah,
Oh.
it sounds terrible. Yeah, I'm sure I was expecting that, and he leaned in and got about 3 inches from my face. And in this heavy Louisiana accent, I don't know if I can do it, but he's like, Nancy, your holiness is dependent on how much Ray feels loved by you. And I was stunned because he completely pulled the carpet out. And he was right. He was right. It wasn't about
Say it
me.
again, though. What was the line he said to you?
Your holiness is dependent on how much Ray feels loved by you.
There's a lot there.
Yes, there is.
You got to break that down for someone who's still processing it.
Yes.
So
So what I
he's declaring what you need to believe.
Yes, he's declaring what I need to believe, as well as I was coming from the paradigm of, if I think I'm doing something for Ray that's kind and good, well, that's all that matters. And if Ray doesn't like it, oh well, I'm doing my best. Do you see the Acedia in there? I'm doing my best. He just doesn't get it. Um, People would really understand, if they knew what I was up against, and that's exactly where I was coming from with my orientation. He completely flipped it on its head and said, It's not about what you think you should be doing. It's about Ray's perception of him feeling loved. So I have to step into Ray's skin and understand his world from his perspective, and then seek to love him from what he finds is meaningful, which means then that I have to let go of myself, my demands, my own wounds and things that come up in marriage, to be able to step into his world and really love him from a place that he will experience as meaningful, which is a lot of work.
And
It's a
it's
lot.
also, I mean, dare I say, a very fundamental biblical principle, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're supposed to love others the way we want to be loved. We're to consider others more important than ourselves. And yet perhaps that was repeated so often because it is so simple yet so difficult.
Well, and again, I'll speak for my own life. Fundamentally, I would read those verses and think, okay, this is what I think I should do. Like,
And probably what I'm doing. I'm pretty good at it, actually.
yeah.
That's what
So
I found
because I'm
out.
doing this, because I'm a loving person and I do the loving things, therefore
Yeah.
it's all okay. When in fact that's a lie. It's a lie. It's one, I'm not a loving person. That's a lie. I'm being redeemed daily. That's what's true. But I'm not entering into the other person's world in such a way of what's really knowing them enough to know what's really meaningful for them. So with my spouse, it's just too easy to develop a kind of um, let's just get along. Let's just do what we have to do. Let's just get along. Let's not have any conflict. Let's just put up with each other. All the while, we're missing this profound opportunity to die to our inclinations and be born again to Christ-like love. And I
That's
think that's
beautiful.
and that's I think that's the core of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. In fact, there was one of the articles you sent me, Sloth, Who Cares? Which I thought was hilarious, by Kyle Childress. He said, a member of the church might come to him saying, my marriage is falling apart and I don't know what to do. I want to save my marriage. And he'll respond with, every day I want you to do 3 things with your spouse as if you are really in love. Here they are. Do these things, whether you feel like it or not. And the response is, well, I don't know if I can work that hard. I mean, I don't know, 3 things every day. I don't know if I can do that.
Right.
And it reminds me even of something you said to Sarah and I in passing, because Sarah and I have done your marriage intensive. And for those listening who are in a tough spot in their marriage, it's like you said, I think 3 years of counseling in one weekend,
Hmm.
or 2 years maybe. I forget how many years, but
Right. It's a long, at least a year. Yeah.
and having been in separate marriage counseling, we went home going, "Yep, that was about that was about 2 3 years worth," in a very positive sense. But I remember, we were doing this really hard work throughout the day. It was very difficult, and then we're already friends, and so you were like, "Well, let's go to dinner." And I was thinking to myself, "She wants to eat with me after all this." Sarah and I were both like, "You want to hang out with us after you heard all this business?" So we go out to dinner, and you said something like that you thought only about 10% of Christian marriages are really healthy and thriving.
Yeah.
Am I quoting you right? You're saying that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm wondering then, is it sloth that's causing the 90% to not thrive?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I think it is. Because again, the hard work is I have to move towards Ray and love him in the midst of what I would perceive as whatever failings in his character, but to move beyond that, to see him as God sees him, and then to love him in that place, which means then that I have to let go of expectations. I have to let go of my own selfishness. I have to let go of my own, whatever it might be, preoccupation, and really consider him more than I consider myself, not in a codependent way. Codependent is more of I'll please you so you please me. This is more of I'm willing to set myself down for the sake of you, because and Ray and I were just talking about this the other day, is that I see in my own life a direct correlation to the extent to which I am dwelling and staying in a extended time with the Lord and receiving his love. To that extent, I am finding that I can extend that same love, kindness, mercy to Ray. I see a direct correlation. And it could be just this stage of life I'm more open to it. I don't know, but and he was commenting that as well, is that that he's seeing the difference in terms of, and I don't say this as any self-promoting because I have a long ways to go. Um, but he was commenting that he can see that correlation. And again, it goes back to that doing that hard work.
Yeah, and that's the, when Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbor, it's almost like you're filling up as you're living God so you can love your neighbor. It's both and. You
Mm-hmm.
can't do one necessarily well without the other.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as you describe a healthy marriage, and Sarah and I have discovered this and are still working on it, but it is a lot of really, really hard work to be in a healthy relationship. A lot of self-sacrifice, a lot of trial and difficulty. Most people you talk to who've been through that in a marriage relationship would tell you it's so hard, but I wouldn't change a thing. And it's made me
Mm-hmm.
a better person, right? And
Yeah.
yet, for some reason, we're not willing to make the transference of that principle to the
Yeah.
Lord. I struggle to make that transference.
Well, I can remember Ray had a client years ago that had he saw this couple for marriage counseling, and the gal was the wife was just very broken and always complaining, always unhappy, moody. Um, and it got to the point where the marriage counseling, where it was digressing into her basically just criticizing him. And then when Ray would try to move it towards what she, what she needed to learn, what she needed to work on, she just refused. And Ray met with the fellow one on one and said, "I think what we're looking at here is your wife has dug in her heels and she's not willing to grow. And you're going to need to sort through before the Lord that this He may be calling you to love her radically and unconditionally, even though you may never have her turn around. She may never turn and give you the love that you're looking for." And he said, "But if you make that decision," he said, "you will learn the way of radical love." And he saw him. He ran into him. I want to say 2 years later, and he said, "I love my wife so much more now, but she hasn't changed. But I love her more."
Wow.
And I thought, and it gives me goosebumps to say that. I thought, this is what we're talking about. That on a worldly people's perspective, people would listen to him and go, "Well, yeah, she's not changing. Give it up, move on, or try to make her change." But that's not the heart of God towards us. So why would we think that that's how we should be dealing with each other? And if Ray was here, he could testify to it, of just seeing marriages along the way, that when one person says, "Okay, you're not going to change, but I will," there's they become radical, transparent, loving, kind, gracious, merciful souls.
And then for clarity's sake, you're not saying endure abuse. You're saying there are levels at which our spouse may be unpleasant or have habits that are unkind. They're just
Hmm.
not going to be able to change.
Right, right. They might be just selfish. It might be that they're not necessarily abusive, but they're just self-absorbed and constantly in their own space, and kind of like dealing with a small child emotionally. But that's where, again, God, God, nothing is outside of God's providence. So He brings marriages together for the core purpose of the larger call of learning the way of love.
Yeah. And, I think as we examine it from the perspective of marriage, you can see how easy it is to be slothful in a marriage relationship because it's easier to, if your spouse is annoying, just detach.
Mm-hmm.
When everybody's home from work, you go in separate rooms and you watch what you want to watch. You
Mm-hmm.
exist as roommates, but you aren't growing in intimacy in any way. You
Right.
might not even be fighting, but you could be slothful in bringing about health and intimacy in your relationship. And you sent me a painting that was just, I think, imitated slothfulness quite well. It was, I think, in like the 30s or the 50s. I forget the decade,
Mm-hmm. From
of a
Edward.
couple in New York in an apartment.
Mm-hmm. It's
It's Edward Hooper's Room in New York.
yes, there you go.
And in fact, yeah, I'll put it up on the screen so folks can see it who are watching the YouTube channel. Again, check out our show notes if you're listening to the audio version and you can see this. The couple are existing in the same space,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not, as John Gottman would say, turning towards each other.
Right.
There's not a level of connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we transfer that to a relationship with Jesus, I think many of us, me included, have existed in this reality where we're aware of him. He's adjacent to us. We've got our Bible. We did our quiet time. We're doing our things. He's there, but we're not turning towards him and doing the hard work of developing true life change and intimacy. Like in a hard work in marriage that is very difficult.
You're making an excellent point, and I think that I think that it's phrased "as on earth, so in heaven." I think that the deception that I held at one point in our marriage was that even though things weren't going well with Ray, I still had Jesus. See, it was like, but he and I are okay, So, well, it's too bad about what's happening with Ray. But what I was failing to see was no, I was deceiving myself. Jesus wasn't pleased with me just getting along with Ray or tolerating him or, avoiding conflict or whatever it might be. He was inviting me to radical love. And so it affected my relationship with Christ. So I was one who was deceiving myself and thinking, he's just, at that point, I think I saw him like everybody's favorite uncle. Like, I'm just so glad you showed up, Nancy, and, and I think that, again, Bonhoeffer talks about this. It makes it cheap grace. It dilutes what Christ has done on the cross to this kind of Hallmark card, and that's really not what we're talking about here. And marriage is, I think, one of the key places that we get to learn to live this out.
Yeah, and it's I think it's worth the comparison to think through a marriage relationship and how healthy that is versus one with Christ. And it's no wonder that marriage is used so often in the scripture as an illustration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, all over the place it's used as an example, specifically by Jesus.
Well, and I think
Yeah.
in Hosea, he talks about that Israel had become like a whore and pursued other lovers, and that he was
Hmm.
calling Israel back to this because of his mercy, calling Israel back to this love relationship. But I think it's dramatic, but I think it's true, is that we often corrupt our relationship with him and think he's okay with it. We pursue other
Hmm.
lovers that compete for our heart experience, and somehow believe that God's just going to tolerate that. Again, as if
So
he's just glad we're showing up.
so then what's step one for someone who's like, I do want that. I want to stop doing the things, checking the boxes. I want to begin growing closer to Jesus. How can they start that tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon or this afternoon?
I think that the key is, and I was just talking to someone about this the other day, is I think it's getting time and space and sitting in front of the cross. I think that we need something to pull us up and out of ourselves, and the cross, whether it's you have a cross at home or you go to a church that has a cross, but to sit in front of that for extended period of time with the scriptures and say, Lord, your servant wants to hear. Speak, you Lord. Here I am. But extended. So it's not going to be I've got 15 minutes. I'm going to pray now. I think you have to be earnest about this, and you have to allow space, and you have to really want it. And again, I think that's where, as soon as you start even moving down that road, the evil one will very cleverly start providing all kinds of wonderful, fun, good activities, so that you're like, oh yeah, that's right. I was gonna pray. Yeah. But this came up and that came up, and then I had company, and then people showed up from out of town, and well, God understands. No, there will be a reckoning someday. And I think that we're living in times where, I was just talking to a pastor the other day, and he said that he really thinks that there's a purging going on in the church, that people that aren't really committed will eventually just pursue their own interests and just not even attend church anymore because they don't really care. And that's really the soundbite for Acedia is, I don't care.
The Stages of the Soul podcast has been a production of the Caritas Center for Christian Formation in partnership with Stained Glass Media. Don't forget to subscribe to, rate, and review this podcast to help us spread the word. Nancy Kane is a licensed professional clinical counselor, retired professor, author, and speaker. Brian Dolan is a radio host, podcaster, and former public school teacher. Be sure to check out the Caritas Center's Spiritual Formation Program, as well as more information about this podcast at thecaritascenter.com. That's thecaritascenter.com. And last, but certainly not least, special thanks to the man, the myth, and the legend, Ray Kane, for his guidance, support, and expertise. Talk to you next time.
This is a Stained Glass Media production.